The human spirit is unconquerable. We are individuals and we are sovereign, born with unlimited potential, gifted from our Creator. Our mission is to break free from the systems that bind us.
I volunteer as tribute.
We strive for peace and prosperity and overcome all challenges, roadblocks, and obstacles. We are empowered because we think for ourselves and we act for ourselves. We are self-reliant and independent, but guided by the wisdom of those who share our values.
What possible difference can I make?
There is no government, no ruler, nor ideas that are able to stop us. We are driven to succeed because we seek political freedom, financial freedom, and spiritual freedom.
That's all for nothing if you don't have freedom.
This is Mike Corbell, and you are listening to The Invictus Mind.
Well, hello, everyone. On the show with me today is a guy I was referred to speak with when I posed a question on Facebook. He is an author, a speaker, an entrepreneur, and an activist. He holds degrees in psychology and philosophy from Texas State University, and his career spans a few different industries, including education, radio, politics, and a non-for-profit entity. I was interested in learning more about his work, which he credits his success to some of his personal life experiences early in life. His name is Nick Reed. How you doing today, Nick?
I'm doing much better now that I'm here, Michael.
Awesome. Very cool. So I'm going to start by saying that this conversation, I wasn't reluctant to start it, but I'm very curious about it. I know some of my listeners probably think that this is a controversial topic, but because of what's happening in 2020, I've really raised a lot of questions regarding my own health, both mentally and physically, but also just some of the things that the government's doing. We saw one of the main turnarounds in this past election was that it seems that the war on drugs, the drugs are winning. And so, psychedelics were made legal in Oregon and Washington, D.C., and that's really what prompted this question. I wanted to know more about psychedelic drugs, including mushrooms, LSDs, and when I posed a question on Facebook, Nick, your name came up within like 2 minutes. So I guess you can start off by telling me a little bit about yourself and why your name would come up on my Facebook feed in 2 minutes saying you're the guy I need to talk to about this kind of subjects.
Well, I'm not a doctor and I'm not a lawyer. I'm more of just a philosophical entertainer. But I have been a pretty open and vocal advocate for the therapeutic and more non-recreational use of psychedelics. I'm a big free speech and free thinking proponent, and so this falls right in line with those categories. And it's good to see that it's starting to, psychedelics, make its ascent back into culture as a positive tool for healing and transformation.
Yeah, lately we've been hearing a lot about these types of things on podcasts like, for example, Joe Rogan talks a lot about this kind of stuff. And I listened to Jason Stapleton, and he had a conversation which really prompted my question today. Now,
what was that question?
Well, more about are there health benefits to psychedelics, to make it quite simple.
Right.
So my personal experience, Nick, is, in my college days, I experimented with a lot of stuff, and, LSD and mushrooms were fun at the time. But as they say, when you grow older, you got to put away childish things. And so I kind of did. So nobody within my vicinity ever talks about LSD or psilocybin. And I'm curious about it just because I had fun when I was younger, but now people are talking about the health benefits. And I know I have some experience with people in my life with mental health disorders, and I just want to hear your take on it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very interesting to hear people talking about the health benefits. Most people are talking about the medical health benefits. It helps cancer patients with a anxiety about death. It's helping people with depression. Of course, you have people, you have lots of young entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley who are experimenting with it for, creativity and using the smart part of your brain as well. And there's a couple Nobel Prize winners, Watson Crick? Was that his name? Or am I mixing two guys up? Well, anyway, who discovered the not the single helix, but saw the double helix shape as a result of his experimentation with with LSD. There's a lot of talk, mostly about the high profile people who've used it, and some of the big studies that have come out about its medical use. And it does have a lot of medical benefits, and more, I think, psychological benefits than it's helping people regrow an arm or something like that. But the curious thing, I think, is psychedelics' ability to change culture. And its ability to help people in personal growth and through a process of transformation. What happens in the brain and from a neurological perspective, when you look at what happens to the brain in psychedelics, is very similar to what the people who had psychedelics at the center of their culture used to describe in their cultural transformation process. They had coming of age ceremonies and rites of passage. They were structured and designed kind of like the hero's journey. You have a departure from an old world. Say you take a youth, right, who's becoming a man or a woman, and you take them out of the woods, take them out of the old world of childhood, and you initiate them into, the different experiences and challenges that they're going to need to be a healthy contributing member of your tribal society. And then after they have all that learning and growth, right, and learn these new skills and values, then you bring them back to the tribe and they integrate that and become a full-fledged member of the adult community. Well, when you look at what happens in the brain with a psychedelic, there's a process of neurological pruning that happens. And that is old neurological pathways that are weak, that are not being used or serving you, so to speak, get broken down. And new neurological pathways can be formed very rapidly. And those that are used and serve you more often through a process of myelination get coated in a fatty sheath that speeds up the neuron firing and reinforces those connections between neurons. It's the exact same process of the hero's journey, the exact same process that you see in rites of passage and cultural transformation processes in the societies that used to use psychedelics. And we are a markedly culture without any coming of age ceremony or rites of passage or any community involvement in the coming of age process at all, except for you get your driver's license and you turn a tassel from one side to another. And what we see is rampant a bunch of boys and men's bodies and sports athletes and politicians that we could hardly consider role models and leaders who are inspiring our youth today. So it's very interesting to see the cultural implications and more the deeper psychological benefits as well, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up at the end, because I was going to ask about the cultural rites of passage you see. Yeah, most, in America, secularly, we don't have anything like that. I mean, a lot of the faiths, a lot of your churches will have some kind of small ceremony. I mean, obviously the bar mitzvah and the Jewish tradition and several other things. But that's interesting that you talk about culture, because let me share with you a little bit of story from 20 years back or so when I was experimenting. Somebody came up to me and, I was just in my wild and crazy days, and they're like, hey, you want to try mushrooms? I said, sure, why not? And as it happens, we actually took a trip down to the museum in Chicago, the Field Museum. And we wound up in the old hall about cultures and history. And we saw these little statues of mushroom gods and stuff like that. And so when you say cultural, I mean, to my knowledge, what I've learned is that this stuff's been around for thousands of years.
It's older than us.
It's crazy. And, and there's a lot of hype about it. It is funny because I was watching a video the other day. I can't remember. It was on Netflix. It was Psychedelics. But you talk about some of the leadership in the country. We didn't see any leaders, my wife and I, we didn't see any what we call cultural leaders on this program, but we saw a lot of your entertainers, musicians, and movie stars talking about all their psychedelic trips and how they became more creative and they became more in tune with the world because of their experience. So, with mushrooms and LSD, I mean, why do you think it's taken so long for them to start hitting the surface on a legal ground? I mean, obviously. Go ahead.
Well, that's Pandora's box. I mean, there's a lot of speculation. There's obviously some strong, it was made illegal for some strong political reasons, not just danger to society. And in 1966, I believe, when it became psychedelics and LSD became a federally scheduled substance, there were propaganda campaigns paid for with your tax dollars that, you know, MDMA will put holes in your brain, and LSD, if you take more than 10 doses, will make you clinically insane. And all of these myths that were completely baseless and foundless, but just were to scare people straight and get people to just say no and not even try it. Because who wants to lose their sanity? Who wants to put physical holes in their brain? You know, these were very high stakes claims, you know. But at the same time, also, you had, if you look at the time when LSD was first synthesized, LSD 25, and made its way through Timothy Leary and Harvard into mainstream society, you had a giant cultural revolution happening. You know, the old structures of society were breaking down. The value systems that had formed were under threat, and the institutions, which are longstanding functions of society, were ultimately, I think, fearing for their survival from this thing, from a mushroom in a field or LSD. And you have these kids who had started with no power, they had no authority, and they had no money, and they started an environmental movement. They started having transcendent experiences and realizing that they're connected to all things. And, you know, they're wrapping themselves around trees and linking arms to stop people from clear cutting forests and jungles. You know, they weren't just crying for the government to do something, you know, what the president should do. They were actually acting as if, you know, their own arm was being cut off. And it was a direct result, I think, of some of the most transformational experiences that a human being could possibly experience. You know, there was a study done that showed that people who took a high dose of psilocybin, the active psychoactive ingredient in the magic mushroom, reported it was one of the top 5 most meaningful experiences of their entire life, up there with the birth of their first child, you know, or first sex, or something like that. I mean, that's pretty influential. And so you can imagine what this would do, not just on the individual level, but on a mass level, where you have, you know, 25 million people who now have been exposed to something that, curiously, our neurology is very receptive to having, and can have a great transformational effect at the neurological as well as the psychological level.
Yeah, you think about the 60s and what they call the hippie cultural movement, right? Everyone's coming aware of what's really going on, and a lot of that is still carried over today. And I guess when I was in college, well, late after high school, it was late 90s, so college years would have been late 90s. And you know, they say that, hey, if you want to really know what's going on, you know, ingest some of this stuff. And I've had my fair share of opening experiences where I just look at the world completely different. And so why I was curious about this is because here in 2020, Nick, we have just changes going on. For good or for bad, we have a cultural shift happening in this country and worldwide. And people are literally looking at systems breaking down. And I think a lot of neuroticism is happening because of these changes going on. And so I think that why this conversation is getting more and more popular, why so many people jumped on, hey, I want to check out that podcast, Mike, when you put it, because there are many questions raised. I mean, do we need to have psychedelics to adapt to these changes, or do you say it's helpful? The reason why I ask is because I know many people who are just completely depressed. And I'm hearing voices saying, hey, why don't you take some mushrooms to help you out? What would you think about that?
Well, I wouldn't go so far as to say that we need any particular psychoactive substance in order to fix our problems. I do think that they're very powerful and extremely underrated tools or catalysts for positive change. And what I mean by that is, you know, there are people who have peak mystical experiences that change your life through meditation. There are people that have it through losing a loved one. the grief process. There are people that have it for God knows why, no reason at all, you know. And I think that, and not everybody who takes a psychedelic has a powerful, you know, transcendent, mystical, life-changing experience. Most people do, though, when they take a high dose. And so I think that, you know, while meditation may take some learning and some practice, you might have to be trained in order to reach kind of these altered states of these other states of consciousness. Psychedelics can kind of give you a passive introduction to it without much work. It doesn't take a very skilled initiate to eat a substance, you know, and sit there for a while. You know,
Mhm.
it doesn't take a lot of mastery. What does take mastery is making sure you're setting your proper guiding other people. And I think that's very important and something that traditional societies figured out a long time ago. And we, with our anti-authoritarian approach, want to just take it and go, you know, to a giant party or something. And psychedelics are not always a recreational experience. Oftentimes people face their fears, which can be a very positive and empowering thing to do, is face your fears, you know, and but your setting and context can completely make that into a very difficult experience very fast.
Right. So I'm sure you're familiar with Dr. Jordan Peterson. He has actually spoken on this topic a lot, and he talks a lot about the helpful benefits that these types of substances will actually do. But he cautions by saying, beware of unearned knowledge, which, you know, I can only associate being, you know, maybe that's what they call, you know, a bad trip, right? You mentioned a second ago that, you know, it's not always recreational use that you want to use these things for, but to overcome fears or to reduce anxiety and things like that nature. And it's been my experience, again, going back to the past, that you know, you need to have a good, I would call it a guide, or maybe a guru, somebody who can sit there with you if you're going to be entertaining this type of medication. Do you agree with that?
No, I would 100% completely agree. I don't think that we operate 100% every single day in our oblique problem-solving Monday morning state of consciousness, which is what keeps us safe. It's our ego, it's self-interested, and it's very good at keeping us out of trouble. But when you enter another state of mind like that, where you're overwhelmed with novelty, and as maybe Aldous Huxley would describe, the doors of perception have been opened. You know, I mean, you're no longer looking at the world through chinks in your cavern. It can be a very overwhelming experience, and even making it to the bathroom by yourself can be difficult, much less driving a car or hanging on the back of a motorcycle like James Fadiman so eloquently described. I think it's very important that we do it smart, especially if this is going to psychedelics, I mean, make a comeback into culture as a positive tool for personal growth and not a threat. That we, from the people from the bottom up, have to use our freedom with responsibility. It's just the way it has to go.
Right. And I think that as we've seen the legalization of cannabis, all the stories, the horror stories that, you know, the anti-drug people will say, oh, cannabis is going to make you insane and it's going to cause all these things to happen. Well, it's been a few years, and now most of these states have legal recreational and medicinal cannabis. And where are these awful statistics that you see? I'm thinking to that video I saw last night regarding mushrooms and LSD, and they had the DARE program from the 80s, if you remember that. And they had all the different after-school specials regarding, you know, what drugs will do for you. And I thought it was hilarious when they talked about these kids at a party doing LSD, and then the result was they jumped out the window because they just went insane after taking one dose, something like that. And it's just like, oh my gosh. But what was funny was that, you know, some of these celebrities were talking about their experience, and they were talking about how time really just starts to slow down when you're, because there's a lot of knowledge that you're gaining. You know, there's people always talk about the colors and the wavy lines and the movements that you see of things around you, but your mind is literally expanding, and you're taking in all of your senses at one time, amplified, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's a different state of mind. I mean, we couldn't imagine being awake without ever having gone to sleep. Sleep is another state of mind that is bizarre and weird, and we don't understand it, and brings us insights we didn't earn. And yet at the same time, it's the most essential state of mind to being able to have your oblique Monday morning problem solving state. And so the traditional societies, as well as other people who are proponents of the therapeutic, non-recreational use of psychedelics, describe it as a third state, in the same way that Indian gurus and meditation instructors describe meditation as an important third state. And I think it's equally as important.
Gotcha. You talk about gurus, and we talked a little bit about the past. Not only cultural, I see the rite of passage. I see this as expanding our minds and taking on a whole new stage of life. But you mentioned just in our conversations via email that a lot of cultures have used psychedelics for spiritual experiences. Right? I've heard stories about some of the very subjects and topics that we read about in the Bible, perhaps, were written while under the the condition of having some kind of mushroom or something like that.
Yeah, it's very possible. It's very possible that some of the things, for example, the Rig Veda is a book of religious truths in the Hindu tradition that was supposed to be inspired by this mysterious substance called the soma. And the soma is like a bread that's pressed into a juice that's drank and gives the tongue of the poet to the drinker, who writes all of these spiritual truths down that turned into the religion. It's like the source of the religious inspiration for these texts. Well, the Bible also has theirs. You have a gentleman named Moses who wanders out into the desert, into Mount Sinai, and he finds on the ground this bread they call manna that appears overnight with the dew of the morning and looks like, they call it horror dew, HOAR dew, which is it's the mycelium. The mycelium the network looks like the fractal pattern of frozen water crystals, ice crystals. It's called horror dew. And he says, it sustained them in the desert. Well, a lot of people read literally, these, but metaphorically, if you think about it, the desert has always been, mythological language to describe your spiritual state. You go into the desert, and it's very possible that not only is this manna, not only is this soma, and all these other weird references, a mushroom or something else, but many of our cultural, not just our religious traditions, could have much more psychedelic roots than we think, including the burning bush of Moses. There could be the acacia plant, which is full of DMT. And if you were to set it ablaze, it would give you all sorts of voices and visions.
Now, truthfully, Nick, those are substances I've never messed with when I was younger. But you talked about DMT. Now, Joe Rogan talks about DMT all the time. How is that different than a mushroom? What is it exactly?
Well, I'm not a chemist, but people do report different experiences. And there are slight variations between different psychedelic substances, it seems. I don't know if I'm qualified to go into the chemistry, if that's what you mean.
Well, maybe the physical properties. So DMT, is that a fungus-based substance, or is that like from a different part of the plant?
DMT doesn't come from a fungus, as far as I know, unless maybe ergot, which was a mold grown on a bread that was used in the Elysian Mysteries.
Okay.
The psychoactive substance, as far as I know, in the mushroom is psilocybin and psilocin, and DMT, which stands for dimethyltryptamine, is the active ingredient in, say, ayahuasca, is a commonly known psychedelic brew. It's a combination of two plants, Psychotria viridis, which is a green leaf that contains the dimethyltryptamine substance, and this other vine that they call ayahuasca, which is Banisteriopsis caapi. And it's absolutely a miracle that they were able to figure this out. But your body is used to DMT. We produce DMT. We produce it. It's what makes you dream when you close your eyes and go to sleep. Dogs have it. We're all illegal right now. And so the body knows how to break it down. It breaks it down when you're awake. If you were to eat it, because it's in all kinds of plants and foods, you just break it down. You have a monoamine oxidase enzyme that breaks down your stomach. So what this vine does when you combine it with this leaf is the vine contains a monoamine oxidase inhibitor that inhibits this enzyme from attaching to and breaking down the dimethyltryptamine molecule, which makes it then digestible, and it can enter your body and your bloodstream. And that's what produces the visionary state of consciousness. Now, how they discovered this out of the billions of species of plants that they could have combined or tried to eat is nobody knows. You ask the traditional people, they say, well, the plants told us, which gets into the whole irrational side of how to make scientific discoveries as well. Most of which are medical discoveries have just been ripped off from many shamans anyway.
Which is why it's so tragic that they make these substances illegal, because we can't study them, right? I mean, we would love to have much more research involved, and we're probably missing decades of possible research there. But I go back to this notion of if it's a natural substance, if it's a plant, if it's a leaf, it's a fungus, something that you could possibly grow at your house or find out in nature, why is that kind of stuff illegal? It seems like natural substances should be beneficial to people. It's just crazy to me that the legislation wants to.
It's a bitter pill to swallow for many people. Not everybody is open to those kinds of experiences or to that pathway, and they think they're downright bad or dangerous, and so they've for political reasons blocked them off from all people. It's actually very interesting if you think about it. It is almost akin to the story of, in the Christian tradition, in the Garden of Eden, the tree that you shall not eat of, the tree of knowledge, that brings you wisdom, and then you know for yourselves right and wrong. Well, today we have an issue where people tune their moral compass to whatever the authorities say is the law, regardless of whether or not, as Martin Luther King said, it's a just or an unjust law, and don't think about things for themselves. And it's very convenient because then you don't own the risk of your and consequences of your actions and your choices. You can just say, well, I'm doing what I'm supposed to. I'm doing the right thing. But the problem is you lose what is, I think, our birthright as human beings. And that is to be able to use the freedom of choice to be a gift in this world. And that requires you being able to think for yourself about what exactly it means to be a gift versus a curse. And that's going to require you eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil and learning right and wrong for yourselves. I mean, every parent in this world would consider themselves a failure if their kid at 30 came to them and said, Dad, what's right? Dad, what's wrong? Is fire hot? You want your kid to grow up and learn for themselves and to become their own mom and dad, so to speak, and responsible individuals, capable and self-sufficient. And yet at the same time, when you look at the way that we operate from our political standpoint, we treat people like children. We try and protect people from bad ideas rather than teaching them to think for ourselves, and try and create a psychological dependency on a mediating moral authority that can tell people what's right and wrong. And we legislate everything. I don't believe that everything bad should be legislated. Kids lie to their parents, and we don't think that's good, but should we make it illegal? I mean, there's a whole host of things that we've started to legislate and put on the books in this giant dinosaur of a bureaucratic institution, the size of, the most unsustainable body that could ever exist, that's wrapping our lives in red tape and making life this unbearable bureaucratic process of taxes and registrations and fees, from everything from being born to driving to the store to catching a fish. We've red taped ourselves into a corner, Michael. We've got more laws than the laws of physics. What are we doing here? Human beings' life can't positively be that evil and terrible that we have to create enough laws to where the only way to be legal is to be a robot. Life itself has become so criminalized. According to the Cato Institute, you have, on average, every American committing 3 felonies before supper time. Ignorance of the law is no excuse there. Now, what we're seeing is just part of the same trend of trying to solve our problems through control and through top down, and politics gets involved into everything. And the more that people can start to think for themselves, and the more that we can start to rediscover some of these very positive alternatives and empowering consciousness tools, I think that we'll be able to liberate ourselves from that. The next generation who becomes leaders will just follow suit, as we're seeing with marijuana as it makes its way into decriminalization, and the psychedelics will follow.
What's interesting is that if you look at the schedule of narcotics, that I think it's Schedule 1 narcotics, which is illegal. Everything from cannabis, which is hardly harmful to anybody for any reason, to, psychedelics, and then also the more harder drugs like up to heroin. I've heard that all these drugs usually create a peaceful environment, but the only drug that's actually legal and recommended is alcohol, which causes violence. And so it's like, it's backwards.
Right. Oh my gosh. Schedule 1, what is the criteria for Schedule 1, right? It's highly addictive and has a high potential for no known medical uses, right? Well, alcohol fits that bill, but psychedelics do not fit that bill at all. Marijuana doesn't fit that bill. Mushrooms don't fit that bill. Ayahuasca or LSD doesn't fit that bill. In fact, even if you look at Bill Wilson, the founder of the 12-step program, he was a big proponent of the use of psychedelics to get people off of their addiction to alcohol, because not only is psychedelics not addictive, they have anti-addictive properties. Psychedelics, even one trip of ibogaine or another, people have reported being able to get themselves off of really hard drugs like heroin, not just alcohol. And so the potential there is incredible, and the research is lacking for political reasons. But yeah, it's really funny that it's labeled a Schedule 1, and not a single president that we've had come up will touch it.
Well, right, it's not a popular subject, so they're too worried about election fraud and all that other stuff. So interesting. It's funny, referring back to the video, it seems like the only experience I have between the last 20 years is one video in this conversation. But going back to what the celebrity was saying about their experience with psychedelics, he said, if you break down 100% of their whole experience, it might be 6 or 8 hour, what they call a trip, like your high period that you have when you're on the psychedelics. They say 10% of that is color, right? You're looking at all the different colors in front of you, right? And they say 10% of that you're thinking about time, which is obviously a lot longer period of time. But 80% is just staring at your own hand. 80% of the time. So Nick, I want to have a little fun here. If you wouldn't mind, you mentioned that your experience with this comes from life experiences. Can you talk a little bit about some of the things you've done when you were younger, some of the things you discovered for yourself when you started experimenting?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I was a very listless youth, and I had kind of a quarter life crisis, actually. Psychedelics, by happenstance, came into my life at a very pivotal moment. And so I was going down the same road that everybody else goes down, the prescription for the good life. You go to school to make good grades. You make good grades to get into college. You get into college to get a degree. You get a degree so you can get a job. You get a job so you can then make the money to buy the time to then do the things that make life worth living to you, right? Well, I'm sitting here looking around at all the adults in my community and who've taken this path much farther than I have. And they don't look like they're in any kind of place now that I'm trying to get to. So that was a real crisis for me. What the heck am I going to do? So me and some other stupid friends, we were skipping school, and we made a very stupid pact to basically never grow up, like Peter Pan syndrome. We're just going to suck all the fun out of life, and maybe base jumping, skydiving, and die before we have any real responsibilities kick in at 18. Real appreciative. And we didn't die, but I remember I was going to a birthday party, and I had a good childhood friend of mine in the car. His name was Miles Senior. He's now passed. But he was just begging me to pull over the car because we were passing a cow pasture. And he wanted to go and look for these magical mushrooms he had heard about. And he just was relentless. So eventually I caved in. I wasn't very strong-willed, so I was kind of curious myself. So we walk through, we don't find anything. And on the way back, we find this massive pile of mushrooms growing out of this cow patty there in the grass. And there's a big one and a couple small ones. We pick them up and come back to the car and eat them. And right then, I didn't know anything about psychedelics. I'm about to get in the car and drive back to a birthday party. It's not a good situation to be in, a good setting. So this was my introduction to learn about all that. Well, anyway, we eat it and get super sick and overwhelmed. So I drive home, and I drive him home, and I go home, and I'm going home convinced that I'm actually going home to die. I was convinced I had eaten a bad mushroom and didn't know what I was doing. And now I've poisoned myself. And so this is it. This is the end. Little did I know this was just part of the psychedelic experience for me, of maybe a death and rebirth theme that is really common, a lot of people have, but I didn't know that. And it seems very real, ultra real even. So I go upstairs to lay down to die rather than go ask for help, because that would have killed my ego and self-image. To be caught eating mushrooms by my parents was worse than actually dying, right? So I go and I lay there, and I remember experiencing or imagining my heart rate slowing down and my breathing slowing down, and then eventually just stopping. And I was dead in my experience. And then I thought, but I don't want to be dead. So I sat up out of my bed, and I felt the blood start pumping again and rush through my body. And I thought, wow, I'm going to have to figure out what I'm going to do then. If I'm going to live, I might have to get over this fear of my parents just learning I took psychedelics. So I go and I look at myself in the mirror, and it's like I'm in hell. This hot wind is blowing, and everything is distorted and scary. And I think, that's it. All right, there's this thing in my throat moving around. So I go downstairs and I think, okay, I'm going to take a Benadryl. I've obviously got an allergic reaction going on, and I can't swallow it down, just psychological. And eventually I get to a point where I cross over a threshold where not only am I like, well, I'm going to try and do something about this. I got to a point where there was this will to live, this drive inside of me that shifted almost from a passive to an active state. And I grabbed this at the same time. I was grabbing an apple, and I took a bite of this apple, and I'll never forget the experience of this simple action, because the saliva ran through my saliva glands into this apple. And at the same time, it was like a flood of sensory information, and the sourness of the green apple just overwhelmed me and flipped the experience 100% to the most heavenly experience that one could ever possibly have. And I regained this desire to live my own life, and a kind of a perspective that you have to take an active role and set goals for yourself and be responsible. That all came out of that. Well, it was the experience of a near-death experience, real or not, that happened at that time. And from that period, I kind of went on a quest to figure out how it is where it is I want to go and what path I want to follow. And is it the path that everybody else is taking, or is it different?
That's an interesting story. So you had a self-induced rite of passage right there, rather than having a guide bring you through that. It's funny. I don't know if I would have the guts to actually go to a cow pasture and pick up mushrooms, because I love mushrooms, not the psychedelic ones, but just any kind of mushroom, the ones you eat for dinner. But there are poisonous mushrooms out there that if you eat them, you kill them. And so my experience was I needed to find somebody who I trusted, who could identify the right ones and say, these are what you should take, this is what you should be doing. The story goes, though, we got them from that trusted source, but he wasn't there to guide us through our experience. So my initial experience with mushrooms was what they call a bad trip. And it was my buddies and I. We didn't drive anywhere. We didn't have any specific agenda. We were at home, but we were watching TV. And I'll never forget, I was watching the movie Desperado with Antonio Banderas. And if you recall that movie, it's crazy film and all kinds of different angles of guns shooting and like that. And I literally thought I was in a war. I thought I was in that movie while I was on mushrooms. And we were all crying and freaking out, thinking people were shooting at us. And I remember my friend had to call his brother-in-law, who's the source, right? And he came over and comforted us. And then he flipped that experience 180 degrees. But it sounds like you and I had the similar experience. Like if you don't have that guide, that guru who can create the environment of peace, of love, of harmony to make that transition, you could have a bad experience with that, right?
No, absolutely. I think that the real fear is that you won't be able to integrate it, and will end up fragmenting that experience off and labeling it as something as such as like not valuable, and we'll miss the gold that's in it without a guide. So that's where a guide can really be helpful. James Fadiman talks about this a lot, the Harvard professor and researcher on this. He suggests we try and change the language around this. And this is no criticism of you. This is just a general thought that you brought up for me. But bad trip implies there's nothing of value in it. And he suggests trying to think of it as a challenging trip. There's always something to learn. Well, most obviously that maybe we should have had a guide and known what we were doing, right? But secondly, of course, what is the insight that's in there? Usually the things, like when people think about a hallucination, they think of it as just a phantom, phantasmagoria of mental images that really don't have any truth or reality to them, because they're thinking of it in reflection from their Monday morning problem-solving state. And it doesn't have any factuality or historicity maybe. But all of those images, just like in psychotherapy when you're looking at dreams, have reality and truth as they relate to man, the individual, or man, even the collective. There is collective unconscious as Jung would describe it. And to be able to be awake and get access to your unconscious in such a visceral way that you can interact with it can create really positive results. And people describe the mental health benefits of psychedelics being like 50 years of therapy often in a single session. And there are therapists putting themselves out of business by confirming that. So it's a really interesting phenomenon, but I would be quick. I would be hesitant before we write anything off as necessarily a bad experience, although there can be very difficult and traumatizing experiences by going into it with the wrong setting.
Well, there's a lot of people who say that if you do too much, you can overdose, which we've already kind of covered is not really possible. But if you trip too many different times, different experiences, you can end up in permanent psychosis. Do you have any examples of that? I mean, I don't even think that's possible, is it?
Not that I know of. I mean, outside of MK Ultra, I don't think that there are any individuals that are known to have been permanently damaged as a result of taking too many mushrooms. I mean, yeah, I'd love to see the data and the research on it. Unfortunately, it's all pushed underground because of fear of repercussions and its legal status. So it is a giant unknown, and that feeds into the political stories about its possible risk and danger. So hopefully, as it becomes decriminalized and deprioritized, as in DC, we'll start to see more research. We'll start to see more experimentation. We'll start to learn more about its potential to help us reach our potential through healing, learning, and personal growth.
Well, Nick, that's awesome. I think that this has been very helpful. I don't know where people have more questions about it, you can recommend any books to check out or any videos that they might want to learn more, or maybe you just feel like connecting with somebody yourself with your experience.
Sure. Michael Pollan wrote a great book called Change Your Mind. If you're interested in the research and the scientific side of the mental health and the health benefits and even transcendent experiences. James Fadiman wrote a book called The Psychedelics Explorer Guide that is a guide for the 400,000 people new people who are trying it every single year, on top of the 25 million who've experimented with it before he wrote the book, so that they can do it in a safe and healthy way. And if you're interested in more of the anthropological perspective and maybe its role in human evolution and the giant neurological expansion and leap that we took as Homo sapiens, you could check out the Terence McKenna's book on Food of the Gods. I think those are three good resources to check out. And I also speculate about some more psychedelic origins of our cultural and religious traditions in my book, Return to Gnosis.
Yeah, I'm familiar with Michael Pollan. I haven't just read a book that he wrote. That's where I actually started this quest about learning about mushrooms, not the psychedelic, but just all kinds of different ones. He wrote a whole chapter in his book, The Omnivore's Dilemma, which is a great book. But he had a whole section just dedicated to mushrooms. So it's interesting that he continued in that thought process. And where can they find your book? Is that on Amazon? You said Return to Gnosis?
It is. It's on Amazon.
Perfect. Nick, do you have any websites or anything else you want to plug?
Well, you can always check out my website, nickreed.co, where that's where I engage with my coaching clients. And that's it.
All right. Well, I thank you for the conversation. It's been educational and interesting. So.
Thank you, Michael.